Welcome, welcome, one and all, to another episode of the Witness Titanic Podcast, the first inquiry into the sinking of the RMS Titanic in over a century. My name is James Penca, your chairman of sorts, as I conduct interviews with witnesses of her great story, from modern Titanic experts to even the survivors themselves. Along the way, I do my very best to provide you with the commentary of someone who has witnessed Titanic himself for almost 3 decades. On today's episode, we hear the testimony of one of Titanic's most essential survivors. I say essential for 3 reasons. First, due to the sheer breadth of his account. Not many witnessed what this guy witnessed and lived to tell about it. Second, due to the fact that he published his account just 1 year after the sinking, sharing his experiences with the world. And third, due to his role as a first-class man, a well-respected military man in high society in 1912. His account, now all over the world in his published book, will be believed and accepted by the general public much easier than your average Titanic survivor. So altogether, the witness that we call to testify today served as the backbone of the Titanic story for millions over the last century. Lawrence Beasley and Second Officer Charles Lightholler, who we spoke to in episodes last season of this podcast, had similar contributions to the world's early understanding of the sinking, but they were not first-class men. They were not members of a legendary American family. Today's witness most certainly was the Colonel Archibald Gracie IV. Before we dive into this testimony, I must give a quick shout out to my lovely patrons. In the first month of the Witness Titanic Patreon, these very kind individuals liked this podcast enough that they wanted to support what we are doing here, and I am just flabbergasted by this, so a huge thanks to them. In return for their love and support, our patrons not only got to pick today's witness, they helped me prep this episode on a live stream 2 weeks ago. They got access to this full episode last week. They enjoyed bonus Colonel Gracie testimony that I recorded just for them, and we are already discussing our next witness. If any of that sounds fun to you, you can join for as little as $3 a month. We would love to have you over there. Links are in the descriptions of all the things. Now, enough talk. As the chairman of this inquiry, I say we call Colonel Archibald Gracie IV to take the stand. As always, let's get to know our witness a bit before we begin questioning. Colonel Archibald Gracie was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1858. This means, in terms of Titanic survivors that we have had on this podcast, Colonel Gracie is the oldest at 54 years old. And in many ways, he is our first-class male passenger. We did interview Bruce Ismay last season. He is technically a first-class man, but we all know he sort of straddled the line between passenger and crew, even though he said he didn't. We can debate that again in a future episode, but Gracie truly gives us our first-class male passenger perspective with no strings attached. Colonel Gracie was of the very well-known Gracie family of New York. We are talking about the highest of high society. In fact, the Gracie Mansion, built by Archie I, so our Archie's great-grandfather, his mansion is still the official residence of the mayor of New York City. So were our Archie IV, were he British, he might be a baron or a count, but he's American, we don't really do that stuff, so he's just a Gracie, but that is enough to make him New York City royalty. But despite being New York City royalty, the Gracies seemed to generate much of their wealth from the tobacco and cotton industries of the South. So, I think we can all put together why, at the outbreak of the American Civil War, when Archie was just 3 years old, his father, Archie III, joined the Southern Confederate Army despite being from a Northern family. Archie III's big moment in the war came when he fought in the Battle of Chickamauga, the Civil War battle that had the most casualties in the entire war, aside from, of course, Gettysburg. He survived that battle, but he did not survive the war, so our Archie sadly lost his father when he was just 5 years old. But this no doubt sort of spurred Archie to join the military himself and become a bit of an amateur military historian. He even wrote a book about the Battle of Chickamauga called The Truth About Chickamauga, which was published just a year before he sailed on Titanic. This means, in kind of a fun way, that a published historian would be present for the sinking of a ship that future historians will dedicate their lives to and will write more books about. In fact, you might say that when Archie, unsurprisingly, researched and wrote a book called The Truth About the Titanic, he essentially became our very first Titanic historian. Of course, he did also testify in the U.S. inquiry into the sinking of Titanic. I suppose a colonel in the U.S. military might be expected to do that sort of thing. So it is through his testimony in the inquiry and excerpts from his book that we are able to begin our questioning. Colonel, you were one of the passengers on the ill-fated Titanic. Will you kindly, as succinctly and as tersely as possible, in your own way, trace the principal events leading up to the sinking of that ship on Sunday night, April 14th? I was awakened in my stateroom at 12 o'clock. The time, 12 o'clock, was noted on my watch, which was on my dresser, which I looked at promptly when I got up. At the same time, almost instantly, I heard the blowing off of steam and the ship's machinery seemed to stop. Okay, so I already have to interrupt. He skips the voyage fully. He skips the collision, it seems. He just jumps right into it, which none of our other survivors have done this. He seems to suggest that he sleeps through the first 20 minutes of the sinking. He wakes up at midnight. As many passengers did, they didn't feel anything. Particularly first-class passengers might not feel anything given the part of the ship that they were staying in. But he also says that the steam was escaping almost immediately and the machinery stopped. And for that to be happening at 12, for the machinery specifically to be stopping at midnight, that doesn't check out with our timeline from other survivors. So thankfully, we can hop over to his book for some much-needed detail. I was enjoying a good night's rest when I was aroused by a sudden shock and noise forward on the starboard side, which I at once concluded was caused by a collision with some other ship, perhaps. I jumped from my bed, turned on the electric light, glanced at my watch nearby on the dresser, which I had changed to agree with the ship's time on the day before, and now which registered 12 o'clock. The correct ship's time would make it about 11:45. Okay, so that makes much more sense. He adjusted his watch, which was a passenger's responsibility to keep on the changing of time as the ship moved across the ocean. He was stirred by the collision, and that checks out with the sound of the steam and the machinery stopping around 11:40, 11:45. That all checks out much better. Now, back to his inquiry. I looked out the door of my stateroom, glanced up and down the passageway to see if there was any commotion, and I did not see anybody, nor hear anybody moving at all, but I did not like the sound of it. So I thought I would partially dress myself, which I did, and went on deck. I went on what they call the A deck. Presently some passengers gathered around. We looked over the sides of the ship to see whether there was any indication of what had caused this noise. I soon learned from friends around that an iceberg had struck us. Presently along came a gentleman who had ice in his hands. Some of this ice was handed to us with the statement that we had better take this home for souvenirs. At that time I joined my friend, Mr. Clinch Smith, and he and I in the cabin did notice a list, but thought it best not to say anything about it for fear of creating some commotion. Then we agreed to stick by each other through thick and thin if anything occurred, and to meet later on. He went to his cabin, and I went to mine. In my cabin, I packed my 3 bags very hurriedly. I thought if we were going to be removed to some other ship, it would be easy for the steward to get my luggage out. The confidence of the first hour of the Titanic sinking, once again rearing its ugly head, pieces of ice as souvenirs, and the colonel not thinking for even one moment that the possessions that he packed in those 3 bags might still be sitting in those bags on the ocean floor 100 years later. So we meet a new character in our drama, James Clinch Smith, a longtime friend of Archie, a close friend of the Astors, a very popular man about New York City, the usual type you might expect wandering the first-class corridors of the Titanic. One interesting fact about Mr. Smith that I wanted to share with you, his brother-in-law was named Stanford White. He was a famous architect. And just a few years before Titanic's maiden voyage, Stanford was having an affair with a superstar showgirl model actress named Evelyn Nesbit. You may have heard that name before. So they're having an affair. And not only was Stanford White murdered by Evelyn Nesbit's husband, and not only was James Clinch Smith present at the theater where this murder happened, but Smith was apparently speaking with the murderer only minutes before he went over to Stanford and shot him in public. So already, Mr. Smith here has seen some very dramatic and very famous events before he ever set foot on Titanic. We will meet up with Mr. Clinch Smith later on in the sinking. So back in his cabin on sea deck, Archie packs his bags. He puts on a life jacket, apparently under protest. He didn't want to put it on, but his steward made him do it. And then he heads back up to A deck, where he runs into a few of his other first-class friends. He sees fellow podcast witness Bruce Ismay and one of the ship's officers. So this is a bit of episodes 2 and 3 colliding with episode 24. Love when that happens. He said that Bruce looked very self-contained, so that gave him a bit of confidence that all was fine. But then he runs into some actually more important people to our story. So back in Titanic's time, there was a tradition amongst really all classes, but certainly first class, that if there were any unprotected ladies, in other words, women traveling alone, whether they're widows or their husbands just aren't joining them, or they're younger and they're not married and they're just traveling alone for some reason, that there would be men on the ship, perhaps they're also traveling alone, that they would just agree to protect them, to guide them, make sure they get there to where they need to be, make them feel safe. If you need anything, if anyone's giving you trouble, you come find me, that sort of thing. And Archibald Gracie loves to do this, apparently, because he had a group of women that he had agreed to sort of be their escort. So the 4 women that Archie has promised to protect for this voyage across the Atlantic include Charlotte Appleton of New York City. She's 53 years old. Malvina Helen Cornell, she's 55 from New York City as well. And Caroline Lane Brown, who lives in Boston, and she is 59. So the first 2 are traveling alone without their husbands. Caroline Lane Brown is a widow. And so the 3 of them are traveling without their male companions. But they are actually traveling together because they are sisters. They are 3 sisters out of 9 kids in the Lamson family. The reason they're on Titanic, unfortunately, is, of course, tragic. Their sister, Lady Victoria Drummond, was sick, and it was very clear she was going to die, so they all traveled to Paris to be with her. She died, they were there for the funeral, and now they're heading home. And while heading home, they ran into or planned to meet up with Miss Edith Evans, which is the 4th woman that Archie pledges his protection to. Edith Evans is traveling alone. She's only 36, so she's a little bit younger than the other 3. So as a group, the 4 of them are sort of traveling together, and Archie is going to look out for them. Now, having successfully found his 4 ladies, who he's clearly going to have to keep an eye on for the rest of the evening, he can tell that they are quite disturbed by the commotion. Gracie then is able to calm their nerves in the same way passengers and crew all over Titanic are also calming theirs. I reassured them and pointed out to them the lights of what I thought was a ship or a steamer in the distance. There were distinctly seen these lights, or a light, rather one single light. It did not seem to be a star. And that is what we all thought it was, the light of some steamer. I should say it could not have been more than 6 miles away. Yes, of course, the mystery ship appears in yet another witness's testimony. This is our 8th survivor of the Titanic disaster on this podcast. I think each one has mentioned this light on the horizon, this mystery ship that never comes to Titanic's aid. And this certainly will not be our last time hearing of it and how it calmed the passengers and crew into a false sense of security. Some time elapsed, I should say from 3/4 of an hour to an hour, before we were ordered to the boats. Then a young English officer of the ship, a tall, thin chap, whose name was Murphy. I think it was Officer Murphy. Murdoch? No, not Murdoch. Murphy, I think it was. He was the 6th officer or something of that sort. Moody, was it not? Moody was his name. He said, "No man beyond this line." Then the women went beyond that line. I saw that these 4 ladies, with whose safety I considered myself entrusted, went beyond that line. Archie is truly a society man. He seems to know absolutely anyone worth knowing, and thanks to his testimony, we have already met Mr. James Clinch Smith, Bruce Ismay, the Lamson sisters, their friend Edith Evans, Officer Moody, and he's also seen J.J. Astor, but I skipped that part. I didn't even have time to cover that spotting. So there's just not enough time to cover all of his friends. And now he will speak with 2 of Titanic's most famous passengers. Then I saw Mr. Strauss and Mrs. Strauss, of whom I had seen a great deal during the voyage. I had heard them discussing that if they were going to die, they would die together. We tried to persuade Mrs. Strauss to go alone without her husband, and she said no. Then we wanted to make an exception of the husband, too, because he was an elderly man, and he said no. He would share his fate with the rest of the men, and that he would not go beyond. So I left them there. Listeners of the Witness Titanic podcast, you should all know the Strausses' incredible story by now, as it's been covered previously. 2 of Titanic's oldest passengers refusing to separate after 40 years of marriage. Our witness back in episode 13, Alfred Crawford, you'll recall that he helped load the lifeboat that Ida refuses to board, lifeboat 8. And so he told us what he saw. He heard her say something to the effect of, "Where you go, I go." How incredible is that? Well, Gracie is giving us the other half of this brave story. Strauss doesn't get mentioned up on the boat deck around Lifeboat 8, but here he is saying that, yes, Ida refuses to part Isidore, as we all know, but the new info that we get from Gracie is that Isidore is offered a spot. He's offered an exception to the rule, or at least Gracie is trying to suggest that maybe there could be an exception, and he refuses to go, not when the other men can't. This moment sadly does not make it into the 1997 film. The Strausses barely appear in the film. They're in a deleted scene, as people will already have said in the comments, but they do make quite an appearance in the 1997 musical. They are actually big characters in the musical. And this moment that Gracie is describing is actually recreated quite faithfully. They are on the boat deck. The last boat is being launched. It has to be the last boat because that's more dramatic. It might not be true, but that's what the musical has. And the officers say to Mr. Strauss, they say, "Mr. Strauss, by all means, take a place." And he sings, "No, I will not go before the younger men." It's so good. And then she says, "Where you go, I go." So a bit of Gracie's testimony, a bit of Alfred Crawford's testimony coming together to recreate this moment in the Broadway musical. So shout out to Peter Stone and Mari Eston, the writers of that musical way back in the day, for giving the Strausses their due. As we discussed a bit in episode 13, it's really hard to know what the actual words of these people are, and witnesses take stabs at what they think the words are, and they come out, where you go, I go. I could never live without you. They change depending on whose story you're listening to, and they change over the years. But thankfully, Gracie takes a stab in his book. So we'll go over to his book for a second. He does elaborate on what he, to the best of his knowledge, what he thinks the phrases were. And according to Gracie, Ida says, "No, I will not be separated from my husband. So we have lived, so we will die together." And Isidore Strauss, who doesn't get as much screen time in history as Ida does, he has his quote in Gracie's book as well. He apparently said, "I do not wish any distinction in my favor which is not granted to others." So Gracie, trying to piece it together the best he can, we'll never know exactly what they said, but pretty cool to potentially hear the words out of these very legendary figures. Also, just want to say, thank God Archibald Gracie survives this sinking, just barely, I might add, as you will see in a little bit here. Otherwise, this moment would have gone down with the Strausses, potentially. Maybe other people were nearby and they mentioned it in their testimony, and I'm not thinking of it. But if this is the only mention of Isidore saying these words and refusing to board a lifeboat, that's a big deal. So it's very cool that it did survive in Gracie's memory. But we are not done with our tour of the first-class passenger list. Just about the time that we were ordered to take the boats, I passed through the A deck, going from the stern toward the bow. I saw 4 gentlemen, all alone in the smoking room, whom I recognized as Mr. Millette, Mr. Moore, and Mr. Butt, and who I afterwards ascertained to have been Mr. Ryerson. They seemed to be absolutely intent upon what they were doing, and disregarding anything about what was going on the decks outside. This is fascinating. In the drama of the sinking of Titanic, Gracie spots 4 first-class men sitting in the smoking room, all alone, as if all is well. He says this happens around 1 a.m., the exact halfway point of the sinking. All 4 of these men would go down with Titanic. Some say they were bravely facing their fate, playing one last hand of cards. You know how I feel about this stuff, that it's likely that they just had no idea what was coming. Luckily, Gracie's own testimony explains. A great deal of my testimony is given to show how unconcerned everybody was about this serious disaster until the very last. So make your own decisions about that. You know what my decision is. Now, Mr. James Clinch Smith will now make his triumphant return as we cross paths with another Titanic survivor that we spoke to last season on this podcast. Then I found my friend Smith, and on deck A, on the bow side, we worked together under the second officer in loading and helping the women and babies and children aboard the different boats. I think we loaded about 2 boats there. This was on the enclosed deck. So now, Colonel Gracie, our military man, he's not just playing cards in the smoking room. He is serving under Second Officer Lighthauler on A deck, evacuating women and children, which absolutely checks out with episode 6, when Lighthauler told us that he lowered a lifeboat down to the enclosed A-deck promenade. He lowered lifeboat 4, one of his first boats that he lowered to A-deck, but it ended up being one of the last launched because, as you'll recall, they couldn't open the window. They needed a key. It was a whole kerfuffle. So lifeboat 4 is actually, when it's actually loaded, finally, Gracie is there helping load it. Now, in episode 6, Lighthauler's episode, I did tell you that there are some notable folks that end up in Lifeboat 4, and that Lighthauler just seems unaware of who they are because he never mentions it. And I said in that episode that we'd have to wait for someone else's testimony to cover some special events that took place when that lifeboat was loaded. And here we are. Gracie thankfully mentions one of them. The only incident I remember in particular at this point is when Mrs. Astor was put in the boat. I heard Mr. Astor ask the second officer whether he would be allowed to go on board this boat to protect his wife. He said, "No, sir, no man is allowed on this boat or any of the boats until the ladies are off." Mr. Astor then said, "Well, tell me what is the number of this boat so I may find her afterwards," or words to that effect. The answer came back, "Number 4." Was there a special reason why Mr. Astor asked to get into that boat with his wife? Yes, I think it was on account of the condition of his wife. If that had been explained to the second officer, possibly he might have been allowed to get in that boat. So as you may recall, John Jacob Astor, richest man on Titanic, he has a brand new teenage wife, multiple decades younger than him. They've been in Europe, kind of waiting for the gossip to die down. Now she's pregnant. They've got a lot going on. And so he loads Madeline into a lifeboat and asks if he can go. And that is what Gracie is suggesting, that if maybe John Jacob Astor mentioned that she was pregnant, maybe he would be allowed to board. Personally, I don't think that would have swayed Lightoller. Lightoller was keeping to the book, like nobody is allowed in unless you are a woman or a child. And there's another story from this lifeboat about him barely letting children in. He is ruthless in his loading of these lifeboats, so I do not think that would have swayed anybody. But Lightoller does say in his testimony that he didn't even know who this man was, that actually Colonel Gracie was the one who said that that was Astor and his wife. So it just goes to show how unaware Lightoller is to who these people are. He's really just doing his job. So with the launching of Lifeboat 4 from A deck, Madeline Astor safely on board, and John Jacob Astor pretty much never seen again, that brings us to about 2 in the morning. It's been an hour since we saw the men in the smoking room, and there's only about 20 minutes left in the sinking. And unfortunately for Archibald, our friend Archie here, things are about to get a lot more complicated for him. Prior to our going to the starboard side, we had rushed up and down in the vicinity of the bow, calling out, "Any more ladies? Any more ladies?" Then we went to the starboard side. On the starboard side, to my surprise, I found there were ladies still there, and Mrs. Brown and Miss Evans particularly, the ones whom I supposed had been loaded into a boat from A deck below about 3/4 of an hour before. There I saw also Mr. George Widener and Mr. John B. Thayer. I speak of them particularly because I knew them, and of course Mr. Clinch Smith was there with me too. And all of a sudden I hear the cry that there was room for more women on the port side, so I grabbed by the arm these 2 ladies, Miss Evans and Miss Brown, and conducted them to the port side. But I did not get but halfway, that is directly at the bow, when the crew made what you might call a dead line and said, "No men are allowed beyond this line." So I let the ladies go beyond, and then about 6 ladies followed after the 2 that I had particular charge of. From Mrs. Brown, I learned what happened thereafter. What a shock for Archie the Fourth, to think that you had put your 4 women that you were pledged to protect, you handed them off to Officer Moody, who took them forward on A deck. He thought they were safe and away, and 2 of them did. 2 of them boarded Lifeboat 2, I believe. The other 2 stayed behind for one reason or another, and now he's found them again, and he's taking them to a lifeboat. And the best part about this, and this might be my favorite part of this whole situation, this moment of Gracie guiding these 2 women to one of the last, if not the last lifeboat on board, this moment is captured in the 1997 film. It has to be the deepest cut for Titanic people out there to see that this happens. It would go over literally anybody's heads, and I'm excited for you to go back and watch this moment. So do you recall there was a character in the movie? He's not mentioned by name more than maybe once. I think someone calls him Archie. I think Cal says Archie. He's the man, Archibald Gracie, the man we're talking to in this episode. He's a character in the film. He's the one that says famous quotes such as, "Women and machinery do not mix," and "All life is a game of luck," and my personal favorite, "Hear, hear." He's just the most over-the-top, cartoonish, rich first-class passenger, and I love it. I think it is spectacular. Well done to the actor who played Archibald Gracie. He doesn't get much more of a feature than that, but one moment, the last moment you see him outside of deleted scenes, I think, is when Jack and Rose, I think they just emerged from the second class stairs after going through the whole ordeal. This is truly at the end of the movie. And now they are up on the boat deck and they're looking to see if there's any boats left. And they run into Archie and they ask him if there are any more boats. And Archie says, "There are a couple of boats all the way forward. This way, I'll lead you." And you will see in the film, he has a woman on each arm that he is guiding to the lifeboats. This is that moment that we are hearing about from Archibald Gracie right now. So just for James Cameron to bother with this is really something to me. Cool that Archie's in that moment, but I don't know who, if Don Lynch or whoever was a historian on it, said, "Hey, can we put two women on a woman on each arm? Because around this time, this is what he was up to." It's spectacular stuff, guys. I'm blown away by that. But possibly the coolest thing about this moment being in the film is Archibald Gracie is guiding them to collapsible lifeboat D, which will be the final lifeboat launched from Titanic successfully. There will be two other boats that float off, but this is the last lifeboat, essentially. He is guiding them, and we see it in the film, but what we don't see is what happens when they arrive at the lifeboat, which for the two women that he is escorting might be the most dramatic moment of their lives. And that kind of makes the cameo in the film all the sweeter, that us Titanic people, we see this moment and we think that that's cool that they included that detail, but we also know where they're going. So what's about to happen to them is sort of shrouded in mystery, as much of the Titanic story is. What happens for sure, like there are many versions of this story, but what happens for sure is Gracie cannot accompany them to the boat. He has to let the women go on their own because no men are allowed near the boat. They get up to the boat. Edith Evans allows Caroline Brown to board first, and she says something to her to convince her to go. And for some reason, Edith Evans does not follow into the boat. That's all we know for sure. Now, the reasons why she doesn't go, they vary between there was only one spot left, which can't really be true because there were plenty of spots left. The boat lowered before she could get in. Some say she faltered. She was too scared to go. Some say she just disappeared. Some say that she said that she would wait for another boat, which there were no others. Gracie does have his own explanation of this moment, of course, and it is: "This young lady, I think, must have collapsed and lost her nerve and could not climb over the gunwale in order to get in. If there had been some man there to help her, she possibly would have been saved." So, in Gracie's opinion, had he been allowed to accompany them to the boat, he would have encouraged them to get in. And that I do believe. I do believe Gracie would insist that she get in and threw her in if he had to. But the other part that's shrouded in mystery is, what was it that Edith said to Caroline Brown to convince her to go first? So like Isidor Straus and Ida Straus's words, they change depending on what story you're hearing. But as you'll hear here, they all say essentially the same thing. It ranges from, "You go first, you have children waiting at home," to "Please take this lady, she has children." Or as Gracie says in his book, "You go first, you are married and have children." So they all say the same thing. Edith Evans is a 36-year-old, unmarried, no children. She's traveling alone just to see her cousins in Paris. Like, she's just a young woman alone. Caroline Brown lost her husband. She's a widow. And she has children who don't have a father now. And so Edith having this selfless moment of saying, you get in the lifeboat, you have much more to live for than I do. Now, because it's Titanic and everything has to be as dramatic as possible, the story then becomes that there's only one seat left in the lifeboat, and it's between you two. You guys decide who's coming. Like, I think that's one of the stories, is that the officers are like, there's only one spot left. Quick, which one of you wants to go? And she says, you go. You have children. And it's super dramatic. What is probably more likely, because the boring option is usually the most likely option, is what Gracie says, that she let her go first, but then she's just too scared to follow. But it results in one of the most selfless moments, one of the most dramatic moments in the sinking, regardless of why she did it. It's very clear that she allowed someone to get in a lifeboat first, and that is very selfless, regardless of the motivation behind it. It's just so tragic because, as many Titanic people will know, only 4 women did not survive the sinking from first class. 4 women or girls, like there was only 4 that did not survive. It was the highest survival rate of all the demographics, and Edith Evans is one of them. So with Collapsible D successfully launched, it brings us to the final 15 minutes of Titanic's short career. Gracie's attention really should turn to saving himself, but he's a military man, he's a man of service, and there are 2 lifeboats technically still on board, Collapsibles A and B. They're up on the roof of the officers' quarters, or the hurricane deck, as Gracie calls it here in a second. Now, there's a proper way to get these boats down using the funnel stays. I don't know if anybody in this hectic moment is aware of that, or they just don't have time. So Gracie and the other men left behind must think of some other way of getting them down. Meanwhile, the crew were trying to launch a boat, a collapsible canvas boat, as they call it, that was on the hurricane deck. One of the men on the deck, when loosening this boat from the hurricane deck, called out, "Is there any passenger who has a knife?" I said I have my pen knife, if that would do, and I passed it up. We tried to slide it along those oars that they put in there for that purpose. Finally, this boat came down on the deck. I do not know whether it was injured or not by the fall, but we were afraid that it had been injured. Looking at Archie's testimony, it seems he's still on the starboard side. So the boat he's talking about is Collapsible Boat A. They slide it down the oars that they place against the walls. It's actually something that appears in the 1997 film, of course, brilliantly. And Lifeboat A does seem to be injured, as he says they were worried, because the canvas sides won't go up, and the people who use that lifeboat to reach the Carpathia have a very wet night, of course. Lifeboat B, on the other side of the officers' quarters on the port side, will fare much worse in that it will land upside down on deck. And you may recall from Lightholler's episode, that is how he and many men survived the sinking, is by standing on the upside down Lifeboat B. And Archibald Gracie is actually one of the men who joins them. But before we get to that dramatic part of this evening for Archibald Gracie, he says something here in his testimony that absolutely dropped my jaw to the floor. Soon after that, the water came up on the boat deck. We saw it and heard it. I had not noticed in the meantime that we were gradually sinking. I had not noticed in the meantime that we were gradually sinking. Absolutely incredible. A passenger on board Titanic in her final minutes, helping to chaotically launch her final boats. The first funnel is about to fall down, had not noticed that they were gradually sinking. It's just more survivor testimony that suggests this calmness, this bravery that is often talked about in these inquiries, that it's not necessarily bravery, it's not necessarily, being British. They just literally didn't know it was happening. With Gracie now fully aware that the ship has been gradually sinking for hours, his focus finally does seem to change away from the lifeboat, a lifeboat that we all know will not have time to be properly launched from the davits. And this is perhaps Gracie could see that inevitability as well. We will now allow Colonel Gracie to detail in full his escape from the sinking ship. I will reserve my thoughts until he is finished so that you might take in his entire experience. To our younger listeners and viewers, and to the more squeamish among you, just a heads up, from this moment on, Colonel Gracie's testimony has moments that are kind of difficult to hear. So just be prepared. Colonel Gracie, if you would. Mr. Smith and myself thought then that there was no more chance for us there. There were so many people at that particular point, so we decided to go toward the stern. Still on the starboard side, and as we were going toward the stern, to our surprise and consternation, up came from the decks below a mass of humanity, men and women, and we had thought that all the women were already loaded into the boats. The water was then right by us, and we tried to jump. Mr. Smith and myself did. Mr. Smith jumped to try and reach the deck. I jumped also. We were unsuccessful. Then the wave came and struck us. The water came and struck us, and then I rose as I would rise in bathing in the surf, and I gave a jump with the water, which took me right on the hurricane deck. And around that was an iron railing, and I grabbed that iron railing and held tight to it. And I looked around, and the same wave which saved me engulfed everybody around me. I turned to my right and to the left and looked. Mr. Smith was not there. And I could not see any of this vast mass of humanity. They had all disappeared. I was taken down with the ship and hanging onto that railing, but I soon let go. I felt myself whirled around, swam underwater, fearful that the hot water that came up from the boilers might boil me up. And the second officer told me that he had the same feeling. Swam, it seemed to me, with unusual strength, and succeeded finally in reaching the surface and in getting a good distance away from the ship. When I came up to the surface, there was no ship there. The ship would have been behind me, and all around me was wreckage. I saw what seemed to be bodies all around. There was sort of a gulp, as if something had occurred behind me, and I suppose that was where the water was closing up, where the ship had gone down. But the surface of the water was perfectly still, and there were, I say, this wreckage and these bodies, and there were the horrible sounds of drowning people and people gasping for breath. While collecting the wreckage together, I got on a big wooden crate, some sort of wooden crate or wood of that sort. I saw an upturned boat, and I struck out for that boat. And there I saw what I supposed were members of the crew on this upset boat. I grabbed the arm of one of them and pulled myself up on this boat. And so we have Colonel Archibald Gracie on the upside-down collapsible lifeboat B, the same lifeboat that Charles Lightholler told us so much about last season. But I want to go back and touch on just a couple things that he said in that monologue there, starting first with the mass of humanity that he mentions, that in the final moments, a group of many people, potentially third-class passengers that have been down below until this moment, when all the lifeboats are gone. That's, of course, the at least the dramatic assumption, and it may very well be true. But what is so amazing is that he thinks all the women have been loaded into the boats, that there were no more women on board. It is almost laughable for anyone to think that all the women have boarded successfully. There were so many women still on board at this moment. What he says, just to clarify, Mr. Smith and him tried to jump, and they're trying to reach a deck. He's talking about the hurricane deck. They must have run away from the water that was rushing up on the boat deck and thought, let's get to higher ground. And so they both try to jump up on the hurricane deck. They're unsuccessful. And then a wave hits them. And this is a wave that is described by others where the ship really takes a dive. There's just this big shift in the seriousness of the sinking, and that's what he's describing here. A wave hits him and hits Clinch Smith, hits that mass of humanity, and Archibald is able to ride that wave up and get onto the hurricane deck, but everyone else is wiped off the deck completely. Terribly, terribly sad. I will now allow Colonel Gracie to continue into the next chapter of his survival. Hours spent in pitch black darkness, and as you will hear here in a second, partially submerged in ice-cold Atlantic water. We climbed on this raft. There was one man who was in front with an oar, and another man in the stern with what I think was a piece of a board propelling the boat along. Then we loaded the raft, as we now call it, with as many as it would contain, until she became underwater, until we could take no more, because the water was up to our waists. Our concern now was to get out of the wreckage and to get away from the swimmers in the water before they tried to get on the boat, and all of us would be lost. You do not want the details of that, nor the horrors of it. That does not concern you. We were taken through the wreckage and away from the screams of the drowning people, and we were on the lookout then in every direction for lights and ships to come to our rescue, hallooing all the time, "Boat ahoy," or "Ship ahoy." Our spirits kept up all the time by what we thought were steamship lights and boat lights, but I think most of those lights we saw were the lights of the lifeboats of Titanic, particularly one that was steering ahead of us with green lights. And then, right to the port side, we finally did see the lights of a ship, and that was finally the Carpathia. And the Marconi man who was on the raft said he thought it was the Carpathia because he had conversed with the operator on the Carpathia. That was the nearest ship, he thought, to us at the time. We had to keep the equilibrium while standing up all the time. If one of us had fallen, we would have fallen to our knees and then to the water, and that would have been the end of us. We stood upon this collapsible boat in the early morn just before dawn. Then, as the sun came up, a welcome sight was the 4 lifeboats of the Titanic on our starboard side. Lighthauler blew his whistle and ordered them to come over and take us off our upset boat. "Aye, aye, sir," they replied, and immediately turned toward us. And 2 boats came right up close and then began the difficult task of a transfer. The second officer stayed until the last, lifting up the body of one of the crew and putting it right down by me, where I chafed his temples and his wrists to see whether there was any life in him. Then rigor mortis set in, and I thought the man was dead, and there was no more use in trying to resuscitate him. After 2 hours, possibly, we finally reached the Carpathia, and the women were put in these seats and lifted up to the deck. I got hold of one of the ladders that was hanging down the side, and I ran up that ladder. The people on the Carpathia received us with open arms and provided us with hot comforts and acted as ministering angels. So going back to clarify a couple things, he describes that they had water up to their waists, but they are on an upside-down lifeboat. How does that make sense? Well, this is what you have to imagine. As Gracie actually says in his testimony, the bottom of the collapsible boats sort of resembled a canoe, and the canvas sides are what made it tall enough to keep water out, but their boat is upside down. But in the collapsible boat is a certain design that has, I'm not great with the technical details, but it has air inside it, so it will come up almost like a life jacket. And they are standing on that, and there's enough people, about 30, he says, standing on this upside-down lifeboat that it's underwater, but it's still providing enough buoyancy to keep them up. So if you saw them, and as lifeboats do see them, survivors do describe this, just a group of 30 men seemingly sitting in the water with nothing around them, almost like they're floating, it's because underneath the water, they're all standing on a big piece of wood. So a very intense evening, to say the least. Then he mentions that 2 boats came and rescued them from their upset boat. Those boats were lifeboats 4 and 12, so the very same lifeboat with Madeline Astor ended up coming over to the rescue of Lightoller and Gracie, the very men who helped load her in. And Gracie and Lightoller would both get in lifeboat 12, which would be the last boat to board Carpathia at 8:30 in the morning-ish. The story always goes that Lightoller was the very last survivor to board, and that is true. I'm pretty certain Archibald Gracie would have been the second to last. I think we can all imagine he would have waited until everybody got on board, and then as he does not outrank Second Officer Lightoller, he would go second to last. So there you have it, Colonel Archibald Gracie, an unlikely survivor of this sinking due to his age, due to his gender, due to how much he focused on helping and protecting other people, but he is a survivor nonetheless. And for those of you who are keeping track, we met a lot of people in this testimony, and not everybody was as lucky as Colonel Gracie. So, of course, Gracie, Bruce Ismay, Madeline Astor, the 3 Lamson sisters, and Charles Lightoller all survived. But other individuals that we met this evening, John Jacob Astor, Officer Moody, the Strausses, Moore, Butt, Millette, Ryerson, who were all in the first class smoke room, James Clinch Smith, George Widener, John B. Thayer, and of course, young Miss Edith Evans. They all did not survive. But the most interesting fact of all, I mentioned earlier that Edith Evans was one of the 4 first-class women who did not survive. Ida Strauss was one of the others. So of the 4 women that did not survive, Colonel Gracie interacted with 2 of them in their final moments. So Colonel Archibald Gracie, he's a colonel. He is apparently in real estate in some way, but he describes himself as a historian when they ask him in the inquiry. And he proves that because while on board the Carpathia, he doesn't rest much. He's already researching his next book, The Truth About the Titanic. And he would spend the next 8 months speaking with his fellow survivors, attempting to pinpoint who was in which lifeboat. He really does the first bit of Titanic historian work, and it leads to the first true Titanic book. Sadly, he would not live to see the book published, as he would never fully recover from the injuries and the trauma of the Titanic disaster. His age, mixed with getting hit in the head and the hypothermia, potentially, it was all too much, and Colonel Gracie did add to Titanic's death toll in December of 1912. He would be just the 3rd Titanic survivor to die after the sinking, though you really could argue because it happened so directly because of what happened to him on the sinking. He really is sort of the 1,497th victim of the disaster. How grateful we all should be that the colonel protected those that he protected, that he knew the faces that he knew, that he went into the sea and not just lived to tell about it, but spent his last months of life making sure that history was documented like a proper historian should. And with that, we will adjourn for the evening. Witness tier patrons, my top tier of patrons, keep an eye out for your bonus testimony. I have a bunch of quotes from his book that I think will add a lot of context to what we just talked about. One of them in particular is one of my favorite Titanic quotes ever. I think you're really going to like those. Everyone else, that's it for Colonel Gracie. I'll put a link in the description to a website, Encyclopedia Titanica, of course. They have his whole book online. You can just read it. It's not terribly long. Definitely worth a read if you liked what you heard so far. Big thanks, as always, to Ege Erdogan for the music that you heard in this episode. And thank you all for joining me. Be kind to each other, Titanic community. I'll see you all again when we reconvene in our next episode and continue our inquiry into the loss of the RMS Titanic.